Noswaith da. Good evening. Moved away from the mic. It's my pleasure to welcome colleagues, students, alumni, partners, and members of the wider community in Bangor University. This evening is... sorry, I've got new glasses, and they're very focused to playing up. This evening, for what promises... yeah, for what promises to be a thought-provoking and timely public lecture. Events such as this play a vital role in our mission as a civic university, bringing people together to deepen our understanding of the major challenges of our time and to explore how knowledge, leadership and innovation can contribute to a meaningful change. Tonight, we are honoured to be joined by the distinguished Bangor alumni, Dr. Rebecca Heaton. Dr. Heaton's lecture comes at a critical moment as the environmental crisis accelerates. The impacts of climate change and nature degradation are no longer abstract future threats. They are challenges that businesses, governments and communities are already confronting. And so this evening we ask, what role can business realistically play in tackling the dual challenge of climate and nature change? Over 25 years ago, following her forestry degree here at Bangor, corporate sustainability as a concept barely existed. Since then, Dr. Heaton has been at the forefront of shaping how businesses understand and respond to environmental responsibilities. She is widely recognised as a leading expert in climate change and sustainability, and a particular emphasis on the role of land use in transitioning to a low-carbon future. Her career spans senior roles across industry, research, government advisory bodies, and includes service on the UK Committee on Climate Change. Dr. Heaton is known for her ability to bridge scientific insight with practical action, shaping national thinking on net zero, renewable energy, and sustainable land management. Alongside this, Dr. Heaton works directly with businesses and government to help them understand their reliance on and impact upon the natural environment. Her work highlights the essential role of policy, regulation, green finance, and carbon compensation in driving meaningful action from the private sector, an area of particular relevance to the question she will be exploring this evening. We are immensely proud that Dr. Heaton is both a Bangor graduate and an honorary fellow of the university. We are delighted to welcome her back here to share her insight and experience. Please now join me in extending our warmest welcome to Dr. Heaton.
So thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. My whole career has been in business, but very much from the role of trying to help businesses to do what they do in a sustainable manner, that sort of change from within. I know many people are really sceptical about business and what business do and say they do. And so I wanted tonight to really just show some of the things that businesses have done, how crucial the role of business is in helping us solve the environmental crisis, but also talk a bit about the things that hold them back. So this is very pragmatic. I'm not talking about the fact that we shouldn't probably use GDP as a measure of success or any of those bigger esoteric issues which we probably need to grapple with, but rather just talking about how perhaps in my career I found the tools to try and create that change from within. So first of all, well, what crisis are we talking about here? I think we all know, but I didn't think I could have a lecture with that title without just referring to it. So first of all, the climate crisis. So this is a chart from a recent report from the EU. It's just been produced from the EU's Global Climate Reporting Centre. Each of those squares is the temperature that month and compared to an average. So it's the temperature anomaly compared to an average, and the average there is comparing to is 1991 to 2020. And unsurprisingly, I think for probably most of us in this room, we're seeing an awful lot of oranges and reds in the more recent times. But what does that actually mean on the ground? So we know this is happening. And what it really means is the period between October 2022 and 2024 was the wettest 18 months on record for England. I know I'm in Wales saying that, but I could get a stat more easily for England. Large amounts of farmland were underwater, and it led to the second worst arable harvest in England since modern harvest records began. And the heat waves also in the summer of 2022 led to nearly 3,000 heat-related deaths, and also an unprecedented number of wildfire, with apparently fire and rescue services recording a 500% increase in 999 calls. So climate change isn't something that's happening in the future, it's happening now, and it has real business impacts now. And I put this quote here, the government has yet to change the UK's inadequate approach to tackling climate risks. And a colleague of mine, Julia King, Baroness Brown, who is chair of the Adaptation Committee, said this in their recent report about how prepared is the UK for climate change. And I think we can basically say, not very much at all. So there are all these inherent risks, but also opportunities for business around the climate crisis. I now want to move on because, of course, the title is Environmental Crisis. And what I'm not doing is going to talk about every environmental issue. Of course, there's water, plastic pollution, there's so many. I'm just going to focus on a recent report that was released in the UK. This was released in January 2026, and unusually, it was a UK nature security assessment. And this is the first time I think that I've seen perhaps members of MI5 work with scientists to say the environmental crisis presents a national security risk to us. The report identified 6 global ecosystems, of which the UK is really reliant on. I'm just going to pull out one of tropical forestry. I am a forester, so I always like to use forestry as an example. But tropical forests regulate global rainfall patterns. They act as these massive pumps, drawing water from the soil, releasing it into the air, and creating what can be romantically called flying rivers or vapour clouds. There's a brilliant book about this by Tony Juniper, which I really recommend. But basically, UK Nature Security Assessment said ecosystem collapse disrupts our food supply chains, our water resources, our disease patterns, and it can really trigger migration and conflict. And so for many businesses, this means potentially really deep supply chain vulnerabilities. So obviously business doesn't operate in a vacuum, you all know this. I've got this, I almost didn't put this slide up because what I'm doing here is trying to compartmentalise, and of course you can't compartmentalise business from society, from government, because we are all responsible and integrated across it all. So society, that's you and that's me. How we vote can influence government, also business, the things that we buy. I think we're clearly all aware of green brands such as Patagonia. But actually, there's a lot of unsung heroes just plodding along, doing a really good job, what they can. I would say Marks & Spencer's a high street brand. It's got really strong ambitions in this space. So there's a lot that business can do, and in response, of course, to our strong messages and pull. I think businesses really respond from government in terms of sticks and carrots. So that's penalties for not doing the right thing and incentives to try and do the right thing. I think what businesses really want from government is that really long-term certainty and regulation, and I'm going to talk more in more detail about this as we go through. So the government responds to all of these different pulls and really tries to use regulation to create a level playing field. I think some signals are louder than others and some signals come at different times. But what I've seen is most successful is when government policy, economics and innovation all come together at the same time. One example of this would be the rollout of electric vehicles, where we saw car manufacturers and business really stepping up. We saw innovative business models as well in terms of charging. We had really strong, clear, long-term policy signals from government on the role of EVs. And then, of course, the public absolutely stepping up and buying these cars. And I just want to give you a brief anecdote to show how recent all this is. So it was just less than 15 years ago, I was working for Shell, the oil company. I was based in a large R&D division, but we were actually based at Stanlow Oil Refinery in Chester, just down the road. And we had this EV car to try out. And I remember driving it across the site. So this was quite a large refinery site. But by the time I got to one end, it said, "You are in limp home mode." And the car was barely able to drive. And, I remember just thinking, God, is this ever going to take off? That's 15 years ago. That's nothing. I've got a teenage boy at home who was born then, and he's now 15. So absolutely, those sort of things do give me real confidence and hope. But I think most governments I'm talking about the UK here, but of course we're part of this global planet, and our nation is part of many other nations which get together and agree things. And it's some of those big United Nations agreements which have really impacted my career and my ability to try and create change within business. So I'm going on to the next slide, which talks a little bit about some of these key meetings, which are called COPs. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and all UN treaties have a COP, Conference of the Party meeting. We're really familiar with climate COPs. There are other COPs, there are other UN treaties, believe it or not. I'll talk about that a bit later, but I just want to talk a little bit about the climate COPs and how they have been responsible for quite a lot of business action. So the first one, 1992, when I was still an undergraduate here, Rio Earth Summit. I just want to pull out some of these. Kyoto was quite interesting in 1997. So that was when rules were laid down in an agreement made that countries would reduce their CO2 emissions. So this is just talking about climate here. Unfortunately, the US never ratified it. It was mainly a European thing. But what it showed was that you could get an agreement, you could write the rules, and you could measure this. And just another very small anecdote was part of my postdoc was looking at some of this and looking at land use in the UK and how you could put that into this. And those foresters here, I'm assuming there are some, I know there's some, hello, would we understand why we said, could we have our baseline as 1919? And of course, that was the year that the Forestry Commission was established in the UK. So any sequestration from trees since then would have been counted on the plus side on our balance sheet. But quite rightfully, 1990 was chosen as a global baseline. But that just shows those sorts of things. We didn't even have answers to some of that. So Kyoto gave a lot of those answers. And then I just want to also briefly mention COP7, which isn't here. This was in Marrakesh in 2001. And this is just another little anecdote. Some friends of mine were on their honeymoon, and they rang me up afterwards and said, there seemed to be this sort of climate conference, Becky, going on in our hotel, and that was COP7. I don't think now you could be in a town and not know there's a climate conference going on. So I think that shows how things have really, really changed and how these things have got huge. A lot of that is about business. Is that right? Is that wrong? We can perhaps debate that. The big one, of course, is the Paris Agreement, and this was when business really started to look up. So in 2015, 195 countries signed up to agree to limit warming to well below 2 degrees with best efforts towards 1.5, which is the most woolly thing ever. I mean, is that 1.6? Is that 1.7? Is that 1.8? It's quite complicated, but the great thing was that all the countries signed up towards this. I still don't think it was in the public consciousness then, but businesses really started to look up and take notice. And by Glasgow in 2021, I think you couldn't really, you'd be oblivious to the fact there was this huge conference going on in Glasgow on climate change. And the word net zero was sort of born and was being bandied about everywhere. And businesses then used that COP in Glasgow to make a lot of announcements. So COPs should really, they're set up to be about scientists working together to get agreement and then countries negotiating agreements. So you agree on the science and then you negotiate the agreement. Of course, they've turned into these huge business things. I think Glasgow was useful in the fact that we did get quite a lot of businesses very focused on being there, wanting to show up and wanting to make some big announcements around what they were going to do, which was sort of around coal phase down and also around finance and really moving money in the right direction. And then finally here, the green box. So this is sort of the new kid on the block, COP15. So this is the United Nations Global Biodiversity Treaty. And that, again, so they've had 15 of those meetings. They happen every other year. So it's been going quite a while. But the particular meeting in 2022 was really special because what's being dubbed the Paris Agreement for Nature was signed. And, the UK government were there. They were out in force in Montreal where the agreement was signed, and they've signed up to this. And it's really quite committing. And if the government have signed up to something, they need to make it happen. And the way to do that is, of course, to put that burden onto business. So I just want to talk a little bit about the impacts of these COPs. Why am I talking about these? I'm talking about them because they have a big impact on businesses. So this is the growth in business commitments around climate change after the Paris Agreement. So along the bottom, we've got the year 2015 to 2025. I wouldn't worry too much about the different colours of the types of commitments businesses made, but more about the terrific volume and how they've suddenly gone up. And this was really because there was just collective confidence globally that the world has signed up to do these things. And so business wanted to get behind it and thought that there would, of course, be all of those incentives and regulations around. So this is this really collective global confidence. And I think this was the era when corporate social responsibility moved from having your CEO in a field saying something good and producing a little glossy report, giving some money to charity, to we have to embed all of this within our business model. And that's what these targets do. So these targets were set under something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. They're really, really thorough. It takes years of your life if you're a sustainability leader within a business to try and set these targets. You have to look at approved scientifically based pathways of climate, and then you have to look at all of the emissions from your company, and you have to work out where they're going to be, and you set a target on how they can be reduced, and then you're reporting on them. So it's incredibly rigorous, incredibly scientific, and I'm not sure people perhaps always realise that that's going on behind there, and that there are climate scientists in businesses really helping this. So really, post-2015, you can see they just really did explode. 4,000 plus companies now have these science-based targets. I think, why were they doing it? Really, I think, mix of genuine concern, but also quite a lot of investor pressure, with investors suddenly saying, do you know, there's something here, we really need to manage this much better. This is going to have an impact on our long-term income. But I would say these are all just targets. And so much as it's great to see this, what of course we really need to see is more action. So I'm going to jump back now to the UK, where we've actually been very, very successful in working with business as a nation and reducing our emissions. So I'm just going to check my stat here. We've reduced our emissions by 50.4% since 1990. It's among the best in the whole of the G20. And part of this is because businesses have acted, for example, the EV example, because they know where the government policy is going long term. So this chart is from the UK's independent climate change advisors under our Climate Change Act. We were the first country in the world to have a legally binding net zero target, and that was enshrined in 2008. Well, actually, the net zero target wasn't there, but it had a carbon target enshrined in 2008. And part of the Climate Change Act said you have to produce these climate budgets, these carbon budgets, which say this is the amount of carbon that the UK can release in these 5-year periods. And they're done ahead of time. So if you look at the bottom, 2040 CB7, that's carbon budget number 7, has already been decided. The Climate Change Committee decided what the budget should be, but also crucially set out really clear routes and pathways that the government can choose to get there. The government doesn't have to follow those routes and pathways, but if it legislates the budget, it definitely has to meet it. And so you can see this long-term certainty and advance warning has been really successful in stimulating business to act. Right. So that's all been really about climate. So the Climate Change Act has been a really powerful tool. We don't have it for nature. We do have various acts around nature, but we don't have anything like the Climate Change Act, which sets this long-term pathway. Crucially, every year produces a progress report which is debated in Parliament, so it has that scrutiny as well. We don't have that yet for nature, and so I am seeing less activity on nature, but I'm going to go back to COP15 because I think this is where a lot of it will come from. So this global biodiversity framework, which was signed by, I think, 195 countries, there were lots of different parts of it. I'm just going to talk about two very briefly. The 30 by 30 ambition, which was this landmark commitment to conserve at least 30% of the world's lands, inland waters and coastal areas and oceans by 2030. But then the key target of interest to me was that it required large companies to disclose the risks, dependencies and impacts on biodiversity. So this is at a global scale. Now, if the UK have signed up to this, businesses were looking at us thinking sooner or later that's going to come down to me and I'm going to have to start disclosing about the risks and dependencies my business has on nature. And so it's been quite powerful in stimulating quite a lot of work in this space. The other thing the UK's done is produce some other world-leading regulation called the Biodiversity Net Gain. And it's quite a small scope, it's just for developers, but developers who are developing sort of housing estates, for example, have to show a 10% increase in biodiversity. And the crucial thing about this is to do that, we've had to define a biodiversity metric, or the UK government have had to define biodiversity. Now you look at carbon, it's relatively simple to manage and to measure. Biodiversity, of course, there's a whole load of different things that go into biodiversity. And so I think one of the good things about biodiversity net gain and the UK's work on that is actually having this metric that can be used. But what does nature mean for businesses? Well, I think we're seeing it being handled quite differently, or I am. Whereas climate change was all about decarbonisation, was all about energy really and fossil fuels. It's harder to just pin down the nature impacts to, say, one industry, much, much broader. I think someone said to me the other day, what's the kind of oil company of nature, what's the fossil fuel of nature? And I said, it's probably the large agricultural commodity companies who are most exposed and who are quite rightly doing a lot of work on this. But I think it connects to quite a range of business sectors. Agriculture, forestry, fisheries, pharmaceuticals and cosmetics all really depend on biodiversity. And I think it feels more tangible to people. When you talk about climate, climate's not necessarily a local thing. A carbon atom is just in the atmosphere. It's quite hard to see the impacts of what you do. I think you see it much more with nature. And it's very interesting hearing some of the governance that's coming out. So whereas you might have somebody sitting on a board who has a sort of sustainability remit, we're seeing some companies appoint nature guardians to have what's the voice of nature on a board. I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but I'm observing it all, and it's a little bit different. So I think, though, what's happening slightly is nature's come along a bit later. Lots of companies have set carbon and climate targets, but we have to look at the two together. Absolutely are trade-offs. I'm going to use, again, my usual forestry example, which is, of course, if you want carbon, then you need to grow plantations of timber, and you need those logs to go and be long-term carbon storage in buildings. If you want biodiversity, you're probably going to plant a native oak woodland. There's somewhere between the two that I know the School of Forestry are very active on working on, and there is something between the two, but we have to look at these two issues together. We cannot look at them in isolation, or we will get some really negative trade-offs. And another one is sort of solar farms as well, where you're putting large solar farms and offshore wind affecting seabirds. So targets have been set on climate that we may now, I think, need to be revised. It's also quite exciting. I'm quite excited about natural flood management and nature-based solutions. So this could be planting trees along rivers, really managing the land upstream to stop flooding downstream into our towns and cities. And this is something which I think business has really taken up on. It's no surprise really that it's the insurance industry in the UK who are most active in this nature-based solutions space. So my next slide, it's all very well doing all these things, but So key target 15 is about requiring large companies to disclose. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about what those disclosures look like. So there's this sort of quote, we cannot report our way out of the climate crisis. But as a sustainability leader, you feel that actually your life is just about writing these reports, collecting the data. And it shouldn't be about that. And I'm really hoping AI is going to take some of that away. I've also always been pushed that more into the accountants and finance teams and said, just let me work out what we're going to do. You can work out how we talk about it. But reporting has driven a lot. So I should probably make this slide a bit simpler. So don't read it all and take it all in. But on the left, I've got this acronym TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This was set up by the Global Financial Stability Board in 2015. And for the first time, it took climate change to the board because it said you have to report climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, boards were very used to seeing climate-related risks because all companies have risk registers. But you don't tend to have an opportunity register. And also, you don't really delve into it with quite the detail that the TCFD expected you to do. And suddenly, I would say that's when my career changed dramatically. Instead of being, with investor meetings, I'd be in the little ante-room talking to the sustainability person. Suddenly, I was in the main room. I was in front of the board. The board was saying, what's all this about? We need to know there's some real risks here. We're being asked by shareholders. We're being asked by investors. So I think that was very, very seminal in making a lot of companies really sit up and start to act on this. And then the next acronym, TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So this has been set up by businesses, by markets, so lots of different shareholding groups, and the UN and various environmental groups. And it's really trying to mirror the TCFD. And at the moment, it's voluntary. And this is a shame. I really thought the government in the UK would have legislated this by now. There's a framework. All they need to do is pass it into legislation. And then I think we would get a lot more uptake. Having said that, 700 plus companies are adopting it early. They don't have to, but they are doing it. But the way to get real change is, I think, to do that stick and make it regulation. And then finally, the final one, Transition Plan Task Force. So this was established by the UK. I think it was announced at the Glasgow COP, one of those many things that was decided to announce there. And it's about a climate transition plan. So it's a little bit different to just writing about risks and opportunities and setting targets. It's how are you going to get there? So you're moving from those targets to actually actions. And this is something that me and my peers across the industry quite enjoy writing, having a very, very clear and published in the public domain set of we're going to do this here, this then, and that actual action will give me this result on climate. So, for example, someone said to me, what if we have that partnership with an environmental group, what's it going to do? And you could work out, it's going to give me this many biodiversity metric units and it's going to give me this much CO2 emission reduction. So getting really granular about the actions you're going to do and the impact that it has. So I think that they're a very good thing, mandatory in the UK, and they are being adopted globally. I would also just want to say, these are the three things that have impacted my career to date. The good news is the EU are combining a lot of it together, and global sustainability standards are also combining all of this into some global standards rather than us all having to follow different regional and local ones. So these acronyms will all be out of date anyway soon. But just to show you how perhaps that's evolved and has really, I think, driven a lot of positive action. So my next slide is around, I've said we can't report our way out of it. I'm going to talk about some things that businesses do report. And this is the really crunchy stuff. And again, this old quote, you can't manage what you don't measure. I don't want to spend too long on this, but it does lead to action, which I do want to talk about. So companies for years have had to report on emissions, carbon emissions, under these three things called scope. So scope 1 are the emissions from your direct emissions for a power station. If it was a gas power station, would have huge scope 1. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions. So that's from any electricity that you buy. So I'm sure Bangor University are reporting on these lights and the emissions from this lighting here now. Also say the cars, if you've got a company car fleet. But the huge thing is scope 3, and that's all the other indirect emissions. So that's all of the emissions from, say, producing this desk that I'm speaking at now. It's absolutely huge and has been slightly ignored because it's really, really complicated. But we are now really seeing companies beginning to move a bit more into that. And I think what good practice looks like is a large company helping smaller companies to understand how they can reduce their emissions. Because if you're a large company and you've got a published report and you've got this scope 3 target on all of your indirect carbon emissions, you're absolutely reliant on your procurement teams to help you to deliver that. And so we're almost seeing procurement, I think, take the heavy lifting in terms of sustainability roles. Companies that don't do it well just stick a contract in and say, can you do that? And by the way, I'm only giving you a year contract, supplier, and I want you to, I'm going to demand, and I'm not going to pay you, within 30 days. Whereas good companies are saying, okay, we're going to pay you when you want us to pay you. We're going to give you a 3-year contract, and we're going to help you understand this. So if you're dealing with lots of small companies, how are you going to help someone on Bangor High Street to be able to even fill in your sustainability questionnaire? Believe me, I've sat with companies trying to get them to fill in sustainability questionnaires. It's not easy. So we need to help them to do that. Another example, though, of a supplier, which is slightly of someone who has made a difference, is the NHS. So the NHS, they're a massive buyer of medicines, 20 billion annually, and it does give them enormous leverage. And they've also set some quite stringent net zero plans. And what they've said to the pharmaceutical companies is we're going to favour companies who've got credible plans. And that has resulted in a lot more dialogue. I think the pharmaceutical company is pretty good anyway at doing this, but it certainly helps to focus minds if there is that your key customer really asking you to do some of this. So that's on the left-hand side. I'm going to talk a bit about on the right-hand side, so the finance sector. So there's this thing called financed emissions, which is basically, for banks and insurers, it's the emissions of all their clients. And they are the scope 3 emissions. And at Glasgow, there was a commitment called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and all of the major global banks signed up to this and said, we will account for all of our financed emissions. It is huge. So you have to think, if you're a bank, you're lending to hairdressers and taxi drivers and delivery men and delivery people, and you want to have all of those carbon emissions because you need to set a target because you want to reduce that target. So not only do you have to understand what your current baseline is, you then have to work out how to help your clients reduce this down. So this is really, really, really significant. For a mortgage company, if you have a mortgage, don't be surprised if your mortgage provider suddenly says, hey, do you want a loan to put an air source heat pump in? That's probably because they've set a target and they're looking at all of the ways that they can to try and reduce it. So in a way it's good, but we've also seen a backlash. So in recent years, quite a lot of the companies that signed up to this have pulled out, particularly in the US. And I think some of this really is because of the complexity, but also because of, as a bank, what control do you have over your clients? What control do we have over the emissions from a house, from someone who has a mortgage with a bank? Very little. So I think there's something about perhaps the pendulum swinging around a little bit in terms of what is appropriate action and targets. So, hang on. Of course, that wasn't supposed to happen. I'm aware that I'm talking a lot about carbon, and that's because we haven't really seen the nature equivalent yet. So I'm still going to focus a bit more on carbon. I'm going to talk about how this whole reporting on these scopes has impacted business. So I'm just going to give an example of offshore wind in the UK. So the UK renewable capacity has exploded. Wind and solar is now 40% of all of our generation, up from less than 10% in 2010. And the UK leads globally with 15 gigawatts installed. And this was really driven by business investment. Over 200 billion was invested in renewable infrastructure. And this is due to a couple of things. Partly because the government gave long-term contracts at a fixed price for 20, 25 years. So this stimulated business to act because they knew they had a legally binding contract that was going to support them. So that was the carrot. But also, I wouldn't underestimate the value of other businesses. So people who were buying, businesses and companies that were buying that power, they're called corporate power purchase agreements. So businesses looking at their scope 2, which is the electricity, the emissions from the electricity they use, and saying, I'm going to talk directly to a wind farm developer and I'm going to buy this power, and then I know that that number has really gone down because it's renewable. And they're worth about 12 billion market in the UK. Major corporate players are all working on different, are all working with renewable energy developers, particularly with data centres. So I know there's going to be a data centre on Anglesey, so it would be very interesting to know who they're buying their power from and what they're doing with that. So I think this is a great example. Why did it work? It was because really of that long-term commitment from government, real advances in technology, and also a real pull from customers as well in terms of big business. So next example is a little bit older and not an entirely brilliant example, but I want to talk about the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, which is something that I worked on in the early 2000s. So palm oil is in 50% of all packaged products, food, cosmetics and cleaning. But I think we all know that it's a real driver of deforestation. And it's hard to know what to do. Many smallholders and livelihoods are dependent on it over in Indonesia and Malaysia. It's also, if you don't use palm oil, what else are you going to use? So it's a complex issue, really, without a perfect solution. And due, I think, to society and lots of campaigning and NGO activity, in 2004, the industry got together with NGOs to say we need to do something here. I had a conversation at the time with the Malaysian Palm Oil Association, who said to me, "But you've cut all your forests down. Why can't we cut ours down?" And there was that sort of sentiment. But actually, of course, we now know that these rainforests are crucial for the whole of the planet. So we can't really, we definitely cannot be carrying on cutting them down. So this thing called the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil was established, and there was an agreement to no deforestation, no peatland conversion, also a lot on worker rights, which were a really significant issue in the palm oil industry. And all of the major brands signed up to this and committed to using 100% RSPO palm oil. So in a way that's a success, but in a way it's not, because it only covers 20% of global palm oil. And so you think all that work, and yet there's 80%, which is really other countries and other markets who are just not so not so concerned about causing deforestation. So I think it was mixed. So I think these voluntary standards really do have limits, and government regulation is probably a stronger stick, but particularly when you've got this corporate action and the consumer pressure. I do have time on quite early actually, but I'm just going to jump on. So what holds businesses back? And I think it's really this sort of confidence in long-term government policies. Oh, hang on. Am I on the right side? Right, okay, I'm going to start. I've missed something at the top. Sorry, I want to sort of talk about time. So, and how we value time. So we're not really, I was taught here at Bangor University about discounted cash flows and that £1 in the future is worth less than £1 now. I think we've just got to do that differently somehow, because businesses really work on very short-term time horizons. The tenure of the average CEO is 5 years. If you work in a big business, you've got the quarterly earnings culture. So every 3 months, you're releasing numbers. You're just focusing on what those are. Every year, you're probably having a big shareholder meeting. You're not thinking that long term. And some of these sustainability investments require, I think, courage and long-term investment and long-term thinking. We also have an executive compensation, which is, of course, linked short-term stock performance. I've always tried to put part of the executive compensation to be about sustainability. Generally now, most major companies have a line which says 10% of your bonus is based on you meeting, the company as a whole, meeting specific sustainability targets and criteria. And I'll tell you, that's the one that I get more engagement in from every senior exec than anything else that I do. I would also say some of the sustainability leaders in the UK, the companies that I see really leading, aren't tied by these earnings and all of that. So I would say Grosvenor, the Grosvenor estate owned by the Duke of Westminster's family, are absolutely leading, particularly in what they're doing on nature, and also the Crown estate. They're doing some really fantastic things on nature. And I think it's because they've got this long-term value mindset. They're not just chasing the next 3 months or the next 6 months. I also think that climate policies and political wins. So we've had a lot of stability in the UK. Every single, so the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008 unanimously across all parties, and then the net zero, so it was increased in 2021 to be a net zero target. That was also passed unanimously. Now, I was part of that work on that. We would be going to meetings in Westminster, and I would have to be walking past all the climate protesters on Westminster Bridge. Sometimes our meetings would be delayed because we couldn't get in because the police were there managing it all. But I think that when that decision was debated in Parliament to increase the climate target to be a net zero target, not just an 80% target, I think probably those politicians were really aware that there were people chained to Westminster Bridge. So I think that does help. But of course, we're seeing Trump in the US now come and really, really change the political landscape. So first of all, when the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, I wasn't that worried. I said, the US have been in and out over the years. It's not really stopped anything. But actually what's happening now is much, much more worrying. There's been really, really deep cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, that's the EPA, and NOAA, which is the sort of data collection service in the US. And the messages coming out are saying the cuts are so deep, even if we have a different policy, different government coming in, it's going to be really hard to actually build that back up. And also, I talked to my colleagues in the US who are chief sustainability officers of large US companies. And they say, well, we can't talk about diversity and inclusion anymore. But we're also being told, can you hold off talking about climate change and decarbonisation? And all these companies had set these huge targets. So when you produce your annual report, what do you do? How do you talk about them? And I was joking with Bruce earlier. I've even had a headhunter say to me, Becky, if you could just take climate change out of your CV, it would be really helpful. And I'm not sure there's an awful lot left, actually. So we are where we are with that. So, Texas, Florida, and West Virginia have all passed laws penalising financial institutions which have sustainability restrictions as well. I also think there's a big thing around complexity and supply chain complexity, and how are we going to crack that? So, as a company, you might have set this target around reducing the emissions from your supply chain, but this is a huge, huge data issue, and we are seeing more and more people started to look at this. I think companies had their head in the sands. Perhaps I did at times. It would just be like, oh, it's too complicated. We have to tackle it. We absolutely have to tackle it. And I think it's beginning to happen now with various sort of data. And I'm really hoping that, again, I mentioned this to Bruce earlier from the business school. Hopefully there's much more we can do with data to really help businesses to do that. I think also there's always been a fear really of legal challenge. So, we set these targets. What's a target? Is it legally binding if you don't meet it? What's an ambition? I mean, the number of times I've discussed the terminology of these things. So legal challenges can come from both directions. One, you've set a climate change target. Have you met it? Haven't you? Could you get sued? But secondly, a lot of companies have fiduciary responsibilities that they have to make money and have to invest in things that make money. And they're worried about investing in sustainability products and therefore not fulfilling that fiduciary responsibility. That's particularly true for pensions. Just going down, sorry, new to this setup. So I think those are all the things which are really holding businesses back. So now I want to come to the answer. Will businesses solve the environmental crisis for us? Well, I think we've seen that businesses can be and are absolutely essential to it. But really, we do need government. The UK emissions have halved because of the Climate Change Act regulation, not voluntary action from businesses. They aren't going to do this voluntarily. And we also saw renewable energy really being scaled because of these mandates and subsidies. Regulation really creates this level playing field, and it bans the most harmful practices, and it can really accelerate the transition. So we need to get this right balance between government setting guardrails, but business innovating within that framework. And I do see this huge role for society, putting on that pressure and that accountability. And this is really this business, government, society triangle, which I had earlier. So in summary, the essence is, no, businesses cannot solve this alone, but business is an essential partner in developing and implementing the solutions. So we really do all have to work together. And my final slide, I rushed through it, now a little bit early, is some thoughts on what we can do as individuals. So we're that society part that I've talked about less, because the main driver for my career really has been the impact of business in these global discussions. But I think we can all think about whether we shop consciously and send those messages to businesses. Do we purchase our energy consciously? And, I've always had roles where I've had this direct impact on the environment. But if not, there's a lot that you can do to help people who sit in my roles within business by asking your procurement team, are they considering sustainability? Are they helping their suppliers to decarbonise and to look at nature? Do you know if your business travel emissions are recorded? Do you know if you have to write those mileage down? Had your company even set a water target maybe, or a waste recycling target? And then on nature, are there green areas outside where you could be growing some nature-friendly plants? It's just a small thing, but this is all part of these assessments. Or even just have some window boxes. I've had quite a lot of conversations with office-based companies saying, how am I ever going to make an impact on nature? And it's like, well, maybe you might put something bee-friendly in your window boxes instead of something non-native. I also think there's something about being a citizen scientist as well that can really grasp people's focus. We've seen a lot of this with the water companies really being challenged by citizen scientists going out and gathering all of that data. And if you are a scientist, I'm sure there's quite a lot of scientists here, please get us involved as citizens, because it's a great way to really galvanise some action. Also, ask your people team, your HR team, about what training they're doing in sustainability. I used to find one of my biggest assets was the staff across the whole of the businesses that I've worked for, not the ones only working in sustainability, but the ones in every part of the business being super, super engaged on this. And I would always produce some training for them so they could tick their training rota, but actually do something they enjoy and learn about and really focus on what's important. And so it's also about engaging in challenging leadership on this. And particularly, I don't know whether you all do these interminable staff engagement questionnaires, which are a big feature of corporate life. And when it says any other questions, ask what's going on sustainability. Because these are all the little drip things which help to make the arguments for businesses to really act. And so that's me finished.
Right, have we got any questions? Oh, just bring the mic up.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. Well, that was heartening is the best way I could put it. I mean, it depends how long you've been in the conversation. So I remember the 1980 conservation strategy, it was very anthropocentric, if you like, and how you mentioned certain things. And I think you gave a good nuanced journey through it. All I wanted to wonder what your position was. When you speak about systemic collaboration, from where I come as an environmental psychologist and the adaptation of social cohesion and mood and morale of individuals, you didn't really seem to get into the challenges of, fear of the future, how people can actually maintain morale and mood when the adaptation in the social, economic infrastructure. And I wasn't sure how far he was in the mitigation mode or adaptation mode of what's going to happen in the future, really. Obviously, the NHS has got its model. So in terms of the mental health mode, that's why I say it was heartening. It wasn't, let's remember we have to be pessimistic and it's going to be a future of difficulty. But at the same time, that is in most of the scenarios that kind of come where I'm reading, glaciation. You know the storyline of how fast it's going to degrade. So that was all. It's just systemic collaboration sounds easy, but how the actual social cohesion model, if you know what I'm trying to get at, how do we maintain that kind of social cohesion?
If you'd asked me a few years ago, people used to say to me, are we going to sort this out? And I used to say, yes, absolutely. And I'm a born optimist. I'm always annoyingly cheerful. But I did used to say, yes, we're hitting our targets. It's happening. We were really sort of riding high. The last 2 years have been really tough. And it's been really tough, actually, for sustainability teams as well. So I'm not an expert on global societal cohesion. I'm just talking about, what I've seen. And it's difficult. A lot of people started having careers in sustainability, some brilliant people, and they're saying, well, have we even got jobs? We don't really know what's happening. And I also think we've clearly moved from mitigation to adaptation. And that's, to me, been the move over the last 3 or 4 years. And yes, I'm struggling to be an optimist, really, yeah. So this was slightly backward looking, this talk, actually. So if I come and do it in 5 years' time, I'm not quite sure what I'll be saying.
Yeah, so I should preface this by saying I am a current member of the Climate Change Committee, but on the adaptation side, so I might get away with this
that was your report. I was quoting back at you. Hello.
Hello. I'm secretly lurking. No, I was just thinking about, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but if you're a corporation, you've got to report, as you said, your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So if you're sourcing palm oil from Indonesia, that's on you. When the UK does its carbon budgets, it's not, is it? It's just doing scope 1.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
And so it looks great that we've cut by 50%, but a lot of that we've done it by outsourcing, the environmental and emission costs of industry and agriculture and all those things to other countries, and so it's a huge distortion. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about how we.
Yeah, so the Committee on Climate Change do actually also look at that. So although the annual progress reports to Parliament are based on the emissions just from the UK, they also do look at the leakage and other emissions as well. So there's always some sections on that. It's not perfect, but I just think we can't let great get in the way of good, really.
No,
on some of these things.
I agree.
But, yeah, I mean, you're quite right. Steel industry was particularly a tough one. There's been a lot.
I guess
of
my sense is it's
yeah.
I think the palm oil in the conversation sometimes.
The question is interesting because obviously it's carbon, but it's also really a nature and environmental impact. Yeah. And we just don't have that framework in place for that. And that I find that worrying, that we don't have that framework of assessment in place to really understand and guide businesses in terms of where that's going.
Becky, I'm going to ask a question about culture within business, which is something I have no experience of and so on, but as much as it frames decision making. So businesses may have a whole series of objectives and recognise there's trade-offs. If we put more resources or we achieve more one objective, it may diminish another. If those objectives can't be reflected in the balance sheet, within the culture of business, how are decisions made about what to prioritise?
I think, how do you put nature on a balance sheet? How do you put climate on a balance sheet? It's really, really hard. So you kind of have to try and get a number. for everything, really. At the moment, that was on my last slide. I didn't talk through very well, so sorry. I did have this thing about we're only looking at sort of profit and loss. We're not bringing in all of these other sort of externalities and bringing them in. So how do businesses make decisions? I think the tool in the Chief Sustainability Officer's box is fear and risk. And you can say you're likely to lose sort of X amount of money. That can work quite well. Or there's an opportunity here. Or a lot of the time, there's something about competitors. So that's the question I always get asked. What are our competitors doing? And some companies don't want to be a leader. They want to be in the middle. So you then have to have a good idea of what your competitors are doing. So you can say, and the reason why we're recommending this is because it puts you're not going to be called out in the Daily Mail of not doing enough or of doing too much. So other companies want to be a leader. So then you can make a really good argument for saying, do this and you will be absolutely seen as a leader. But also perhaps it might bring some other unplanned sort of impact. So you might say make a restriction on lending to certain sectors and then get lots of other sectors coming to you because of that, saying this is great, we love your stance. So I think you just have to get every single tool that you can, really. Reputation and where you sit with your competitors are two big levers.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. I wonder if you'd care to just focus for a few minutes upon agriculture, particularly in Wales, if you have any expertise, and the failure of 75% of farmers to have any desire to take up the government, the Sened's commitment to pay them, recompense them for environmental changes to their practices.
I'm not an expert on this at all, so just to say, I do know that some of it was seen as too restrictive for local farms. I live in Wales, I live in a farming community. I didn't know it was that high a number. I mean, that's not good. So we have to really analyse that and understand why and what we can do to get farmers on board. I think the restriction, there was the 10% of all farms having to have trees, which I knew was causing an issue. But that's been rolled back. So I would hope that might have helped some farmers to take up some of it.
Hi, Becky. Nice talk. Thank you very much. I had a more detailed question, actually. I wonder if you could go back to your slide where you showed the timeline in commitment and the targets by the businesses. This is one of the first slides. Yeah, that one, actually. Yeah.
Is it wrong?
Previous one, sorry.
Sorry.
Or go further, yeah. The graph, sorry, the next one.
Oh, that
Apologies.
one. Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that's two rates of change, and it changes in between 2019 and 20, where you see a distinctively larger rate of positive change? Does that lead to anything diagnostic? What happened between 19
Paris
and 20?
was 2021.
Yes, it just seems to be before then.
But I think businesses know what's going to happen.
Okay.
So, and also before the Paris Agreement was signed, the science had come out. And so my career, I've always followed the science, because the science will translate to government policy, which will translate to business policy. So I think Paris, the success of Paris was that they even got the word sort of 1.5 in. So I think there was a thought. Copenhagen had been before and it had failed because it had been a top-down imposition approach. Whereas Paris was a bottom-up approach. They changed the whole approach and said it's going to be something around, it's called nationally determined contribution. So it's about countries setting their own contribution that would be in line to global reduction in climate change, but it would be in line with these different degrees. And so I think there was a thought that Paris was going to be successful, and it really did take off. It also takes quite a while to do some of these things as well. So that was 21, and probably the 50% increase, I'm just looking at it now, to 23 is probably just because it took quite a long time to get your act together and do the science-based target work. It's a good year process at least. So also changes within SBTI itself. So it was very small, and it only looked at certain industries, and then it started looking at a lot more industries. Most of that growth has been Southeast Asia. That's the point I should say. So most of the 24-25 is Southeast Asia really taking off.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky, for that. I was just wondering, you mentioned about competitors. Obviously, geopolitically, there's a lot of competition going on. And I wondered what China, India, Russia, how they're approaching these types of questions as well, and you obviously focused on America, and I just wondered, there's a lot of other world out there, obviously.
There is. So it was interesting, and one of my roles when I was on the Climate Change Committee was actually to talk to other nations and say, we've got this act, it's brilliant, and we're now seeing other countries do that. So China actually now has set up a really similar framework. I can't really talk about the other countries, but I think that's quite exciting to see China do that. They are absolutely a leader because they want to get away, from oil and gas. They see the absolute, the business opportunity for them in making solar panels and doing offshore wind. So they are manufacturing all these technologies and things that we need globally because they think it's a commercial opportunity. So actually China are doing a great deal. I'm not really in a position to talk about all the other countries, sorry.
I guess that has a lot of nature impacts, though, in terms of...
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point.
Manufacturing solar panels, that just seems very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And also, I haven't talked as much about the people side, but that's also been, the just transition and worker rights and, what's going on with batteries. And that's all very much part of this. I just couldn't really decide what to talk about in 50 minutes or so.
So you point out a couple of things about how change can be driven. One is regulatory compliance-driven change, and that can drive change by businesses across the value chains. That's clear, and so can consumer pressure and decisions that can drive the way businesses source things, how they operate their businesses. Those all operate in the time. I was interested in this question about time frame for boards making decisions and being able to take on board the need for change over longer term. So we hear about businesses now thinking about, well, actually, climate change or the nature crisis is going to affect our business in some way, but it's on quite a long timeline. So I'm just wondering, what's your view on the capacity of the kind of the quarterly annual report focused board to make those decisions about things which may not even affect them when they're still even on the board?
Well, I think that's an issue. So I said what's holding back is because of that. So, but I think climate change is happening now, and risk assessments that I wrote, 10 years ago are coming true. So that's so, yeah. So and nature risks can be much more nature collapse, nature risk, much more, much nearer term as well. So yes, I think there is something about, like I said, the example is companies which aren't so bound by that are doing much more on these things.
Okay, I think that is one more question.
You haven't really talked about it, but I'm intrigued by what your view might be on it, of the carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets in particular, or the nature markets. Do you see those as a significant opportunity for positive change, or are they just a distraction?
I first sold carbon to the World Bank and their World Bank Prototype Carbon Fund in the year 2000. I was really excited then. I really thought there was this fantastic way of preserving rainforests and being paid for it. And here we are 25 years later. Yeah, I'm not completely negative about it. I think it has a role. I quite like Oxford University's work on this, where they have their principles. And it says, first of all, you have to reduce, and then you have to sort of remove carbon, and then finally you can think about perhaps doing some offsetting. And the quality of offsets are very variable. I think, I wouldn't deny, for British forestry, it's been good. It's, we have got more trees in the ground because of it, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. So yeah, I'm not against it, and I think with nature, I'm working now on some projects where companies who know that they're going to have a negative impact on nature are saying, well, can we, essentially buy a nature offset by saying, actually, we'll do some good over here, whilst trying to reduce our impact on nature, but we will do some good over here. So I absolutely think it has a role, definitely. Is it the be-all and end-all? No, but I'm very happy to work in it. So yes, I think it's a good thing.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you in particular to